that since Mass Senior Action began back in the 1980s here, transportation has been one of the key elements of its work. There's a very important reason for that, because as we get older, it's our lifeline to independence, it's our lifeline to being able to participate in our communities, is the ability to get where we need to go without threatening everybody else by getting behind the wheel and driving a massive thing. And, it's one of the reasons I did decide that Boston would be a good place for the Boston area would be a good place to move when I was looking for a place to retire. Because Miami has, if you think we've got deficiencies in our public transportation system, there are other places you can look that are even worse. Another good thing to say about Mass Senior Action is that we organize based upon mobilizing seniors ourselves to work together with our people power to try to achieve the goals that we work on. We're currently working on healthcare issues and other issues like that and transportation. And when you do that enough, you come to realize that all of the impossibilities that many experts tell you are there are ephemeral impossibilities. They will disappear if you organize enough and create enough of a problem for those who are in charge of solving society's problems, for its owners, that they have to make concessions. And being a senior, I'm old enough to have lived through many of the impossibilities Jonathan mentioned earlier. The Civil Rights Movement, which we have a long way to go, but I grew up in Virginia where there were colored water fountains and white water fountains, and I saw the transition that people made against the power. So that's really what it was. And I served in Vietnam, as was mentioned earlier, and started marching against it when people were throwing eggs from the sideline and we were traitors, and the percentage of public opinion in our favor was 6. And we were trying to transit, and by the time we finally got out of Vietnam, which seemed to me then to take forever, but was only really a small amount of time to change the whole concept of power and what can be done and where money should be spent. We were 95%, and they finally couldn't pretend to be a democracy and not get out of the place. And that's the kind of movement that we have to build, and that is what will change the logjam in Washington and lead to funding from the state. Fortunately, in Massachusetts, thanks to what people have done before, we have some ways that the people can get directly involved in trying to change funding. And we in Mass Senior Action are involved in it, as are many of the other groups here, Peace Action, I know, Budget for All. But there is a petition drive now being organized by the Raise Up Coalition, which strikes at 2 of the important problems that we have in our society. Yeah, they were on the table. I hope nobody who has not already signed it gets out of here without signing it. And there will be, I'm sorry?
Sign it.
And there will be, I thought you were warning me about time.
No.
I do tend to go on in my older age. This petition aims at inequality, which is, I believe, one of the real reasons why we, unless we mobilize, have a problem. Our governments, and I have to say, I've heard the Republican Party criticized quite a bit here for its attitudes. But I moved from a Republican state to a state that was a one-party, Democratic Party state with a Democrat control in the House, a Democrat control in the Senate, and at the time I moved, a Democratic governor. And we were not addressing these problems of transit or anything else. Wherever we are, what tends to happen is those who have the wealth tend to have the ear of those who are designed to govern, unless the people do organize to an extent to change it. So I would strongly recommend that everybody go to the hearing that's taking place next Wednesday on Budget for All to send a message, because it's only people power that will get that through, and also to the hearing which is talking about undermining Citizens United so that we have more democracy in our process. But one place we do have a little bit of democracy, only because people fought for it and won it in previous generations, is the initiative process and the ability to change the Constitution through people power exercised in the streets, in this case, in a nice, polite, quiet way by asking people to sign their petitions so we get enough of a statement of popular desire that we can actually make a change. What the Raise Up petition will do is it will add a tax of 4% on all the income individual citizens make above $1 million a year. And we'll spend that on transportation and education in the state. Now, it's nowhere near enough to do the kinds of things that we know need to be done, but that is potentially $500 million or $750 million a year for transportation every year if this thing passes. And it's designated in this that it will go to transportation. It's not something that the legislature will decide how it's going to be spent. I mean, they can decide within what goes to transportation how it's going to be spent on transportation. You know, how much on roads, how much on public transit in the cities. But it has to be spent on transportation.
I thought you said education too.
Well,
Education is also there, right? Those are the two places it has to be spent on, education as well. It does not, you know, prescribe 50% here and 50% there. Both are systems in dire need of investment. And this will accomplish that to a limited extent. It will raise $1.5 billion a year. That's why I was sort of splitting it for how much would be spent on transportation. Although it might vary from year to year, you know, which went where, but they would have to spend a lot on both. The process is kind of awkward because although we won the right, or our grandfathers and grandmothers won the right to change the law, the people who don't want us to have it tried to make it as hard as possible. So we have to collect 65,000 valid signatures this fall. And in order to do that, the Raise Up Coalition is trying to collect 120,000 signatures to turn in from around the state, so that we'll at least have half of them, we believe, valid signatures that they'll have to recognize. And we're at 50% mark. We don't have half the time left. We can only collect it until November 15th. And then all of them have to be turned in to the powers that be. But we have over 50,000 signatures already collected from around the state, and we are on the final push to collect more. After this meeting, there will be a team that's going to the book fair over here. People are willing to give up not only their mornings and early afternoons, but later in the afternoon. I know Cole is going to be involved in collecting those.
We're going to start at 2 in Copley Square.
Yeah.
Where they have a book fair. Should be a good place to collect.
But we also have lots of signatures here. If you can't collect today but can take some with you to circulate among your neighbors, to talk to your friends, to take to work and ask other people to sign them, this is something that is very important. And the information about Budget for All, you can find there the number to call if you have some signatures to turn in. So that is something that we can definitely do right here today. And it's a pretty simple process. In the process of getting these signatures, we start the clock. Once we turn them in, we have to have 2 sessions of the legislature where they take up the constitutional change we're proposing in the legislature. And we have to get at least 25% of the vote in each of those constitutional amendments, which we do not believe will be a political problem once the convention is convened. Our problem will be making sure that nobody blocks the convening of a constitutional convention this by next July, and then another one after the next legislature is elected. And that will depend on people power and how much of a spotlight we can shine on it. Then it goes to the people for a vote in November of 2018.
Another round of signature collection.
No other, not a second round,
Not this one?
not for a constitutional.
Wow,
What they have instead of it is the requirement that 2 sessions
All right.
meet in constitutional convention. You know, this same coalition took up getting the minimum wage and paid sick time for people in Massachusetts last year. And the minimum wage, they had been through the legislature for a dozen years trying to move it up, you know, and never were able to get this Democratic legislature with Democratic governors to pass it until we got the signatures that posed the question that either they did it or the people were going to do it. And then they passed something that they thought would be better than what we might get if we were on the ballot. And they didn't even think they needed to do the sick time. They thought they might be able to defeat the sick time. But the people won that in the initiative. So this is a very concrete way that we can take a very small step. And I can answer more details about the specifics of the tax program and what we're trying to do around it later.
It's by town, each petition, so you can't have people from different communities on the same petition. So if you're gonna be talking to people from different places, make sure you get enough copies.
Well, thank you very much, Kirsty. Thank you, folks, for hanging in here. Thanks to Lori for that, Lori Tamor-Berry and her colleagues for that super lunch. All right, so we all know, we've lived through it, we've heard about it, the tens of thousands of people, this Boston area commuters, had so much difficulty getting to work, getting their kids to school, getting to healthcare facilities because of the inability of the transit system to handle it. And that represented decades of failure of adequate investment. It's not just in Boston. Some of you may remember May 13th, a derailment of Amtrak train outside Philadelphia, problems in New Jersey transit. It's the whole Northeast corridor that there's a problem, and then the lack of a tunnel under the Hudson River. Finally, Christie and Cuomo got together and recognized, okay, we needed a tunnel under the Hudson. Cuomo says this federal commitment is both necessary and appropriate. It doesn't have to be federally funded because the huge $20 billion price tag, the fact that this project is a national priority. In addition to the lack of tunnel, constant accidents on the Northeast corridor, in part because of the failure to invest in signal technology, communication technology, et cetera.
Continue.
Thank you, great.
I'll work around you.
Okay, so first I just want to remind people that historically, right, it was the federal government that that built the transit systems most of us use. The interstate highway system, you guys may have your qualms about it, but in terms of improving transportation around the United States and allowing the whole economy all over the country to raise up, enormously valuable. It was not financed by property taxes. It wasn't, financed by user fees. It was the income taxes and the federal budget. The red line, right, which is, with all its problems, still one of the best transit systems in the country. All you have to do is go to one of those Midwestern cities that there is no T and there's no trolley, and you got to wait for a bus that doesn't run at nights and weekends. Those red line cars were purchased with a very, very, very substantial federal subsidy. We wouldn't have them without it. Now, and this is why I'm showing slides, because you can't communicate this by words. So here is the 2015, the current budget, the discretionary spending. This is money that was under the congressional control. It's almost all tax dollars income tax dollars, corporate tax dollars, maybe a few fees. Most of this is tax dollars that Americans are sending to Washington. And of that $1.1 trillion, funny, they didn't have any problem finding $625 billion to send to the Pentagon and their contractors. You never hear this, but the reason the Republicans are going to cut every sector, housing, veterans benefits, Medicare, energy and environment, biomedical research, is because if they don't cut those, they can't spend that money. And every elected politician, including Democrats, says, oh, those are two separate. Well, they have nothing to do with each other. And I've been in Washington, lobbying, say, oh, it's military budget. It's one pool of money, right? It's the national budget that we send to Washington, and they can change it any way they want. And they don't want you to say, hey, why are we spending that money? So they say, oh, well, that's something. In my experience, at least talking to people on my street, which is in Cambridge, and many highly educated people, they think the Pentagon budget is not part of the Congress. This comes from somewhere else. It's some other budget. They don't realize it's their tax dollars that are being spent. Different way to look at it. Here's the military spending, and here's transportation. It's so small you can hardly read the value here on the thing. The NIH, the science budget, all research on all human diseases that afflict the whole population. You're talking about $30 billion. It's the coffee money in the Pentagon budget. Now, I believe in Veterans Affairs. I believe in taking care of our troops. But most of this money goes to private corporations in cost-plus, non-audited super profits. And I'm going to talk about that in terms of nuclear submarines, because we think that what they ought to be building in New London, Connecticut is passenger trains and locomotives, and not nuclear submarines. So there's lots of controversy about parts of the military budget, Afghanistan, the Middle East, etc. But I want to focus in on the nuclear weapons portion of the military budget. Most people in this room are old enough to remember that these bombs have been dropped, wiped out all the men, women, and children in those two cities. And those bombs were peanuts compared to the current weapons. So, the United States has this nuclear triad: bombers, fixed missiles and silos, and submarines. We currently have 14 Ohio-class nuclear submarines. Each one is armed with 24 Trident D5 missiles. Each of those missiles has 12 independently targeted warheads. One sub launching its missiles can wipe out the major cities of any country in the world: Russia, China, you name it. Two submarines, you could wipe out the major cities of many of them. Those detonations we now know talk about climate change, right? Even a small exchange, for example, between India and Pakistan, puts so much dust in the atmosphere that Rutgers' team has shown that the temperature of the whole Earth would go down, crops would die off, there'd be worldwide famine, and people, hundreds of millions of people would die all over the world. The exchange might be between India and Pakistan, but Americans and Russians would lose their life. So we don't need 14 Ohio-class submarines, right? We need maybe 3, one in the Atlantic, one in the Pacific, and one if the others break down. The administration, Obama's administration, who said he's going to bring nuclear disarmament in his time, has proposed to upgrade $1 trillion over the next 30 years. They're going to buy between 8 and 12 more nuclear submarines, $4 billion each. Well, in Peace Action and other groups, we assess we don't need these submarines. They put us at risk. Other countries think, what are they doing that for? Must be for strike capacity. Decreases our national security, does not increase it, and cost a fortune. I will send you all an article myself and a colleague recently published, where we show that one of the major forces driving this thing is the corporations that have the contracts. Because in their monopoly contracts, you can't send them to Japan. Congress won't pay for submarines built in Japan or China have to be built in the US. They're cost plus, no matter how inefficiently they produce these submarines, they make a bundle. There's no auditing because of national security. Can't find out what goes on. And one of the ways they use this money is an enormous lobbying effort to continue to support it. So, this is from the Congressional Budget Office. They assess over the next 10 years $350 billion, $35 billion a year for just the upgrade of these nuclear weapons delivery systems. So let's say, forget about nuclear disarmament. We're not even talking about getting rid of the 4,500 warheads. We're just saying, don't further increase it. That saves $35 billion a year. You pull a significant amount of that money into public transit. And where's my red line? Well, I have a whole bunch of slides with the cost of replacing the 170 red line cars, right, with the actual budget estimates and stuff like that. Costs money, but doesn't cost anything like $35 billion. So, if we don't upgrade and modernize the nuclear submarines, we could save $100 billion right off top, increase our national security. That still maintains this terrible situation where you have thousands and thousands of warheads on alert. We invest that in public transit, vastly improve public transit in the U.S. And the last point is, some of you know that nowadays, that's for many years, like New York City bought new subway cars, they were made in Japan. They got to ship them across the ocean. Subway cars are heavy, right? This used to be a major New England industry, the manufacture of passenger cars and locomotives. It's gone, it's disappeared, it's all been outsourced. So now the current contracts with Bombardier to replace some new green line cars and red line cars has them being assembled in Springfield and maybe is it Pittsfield?
Yeah.
So they're manufactured somewhere else and then they'll ship the parts and assemble it. But why should they be assembled in Springfield? Why shouldn't they be manufactured in Springfield? Why shouldn't they be manufactured in New London, where there's all this equipment for handling heavy machinery? If Congress can mandate that the only place you can build nuclear submarines is in the continental United States, they can also mandate that the only place you can manufacture subway cars and locomotives is in the domestic United States. Perfectly within the political power to do that. It's just the corporations, want to be able to outsource it, but there's no reason it has to be. Now, some of you are thinking, because when we try to talk to transit activists around this, many of them, not the ones here who are forcing, but many, well, that's pie in the sky, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual situation.
I love pie.
Okay. So, you got to start somewhere, right? The fact of the matter is that one of the things about the Republican budget or the congressional budget, it cuts every sector of human needs, right? Food stamps. It's lowering the standard of living for middle class Americans, and we're going to see a response. And we in Peace Action, in the Budget for All, think we have to keep talking about this and explain to people, yeah, the money is there. There's plenty of money. $600 billion of your tax dollars, not somebody else's tax dollars, your tax dollars. You shift it, you can get these priorities dealt with. It means rebuilding a kind of movement that we haven't had in 10 to 20 years, but we've seen it in the past in our lifetimes. No reason it can't happen again. Little reforms like this are a first step. Hearings on Wednesday, bills, and hope lives eternal. So thank you very much.
We've been in a fiscal crisis in Washington ever since 2010, okay? As soon as the Great Recession hit, there's been a war in Washington over how to respond. One side says we need austerity. We need to balance the budget. We can't afford to spend anything. The other side says we have to invest in order to stimulate the economy and get out of the recession. And that struggle is still going on. And as you know, the Republicans control both houses of Congress, and they're gonna apparently elect Paul Ryan, who's one of the architects or exponents of the austerity doctrine, as Speaker of the House next week.
Except in his own district. Except in his own district.
And week after next, the government's going to hit the debt ceiling, in which they will not be able to pay debts of the United States government unless Congress raises the debt ceiling. And every time the government has hit the debt ceiling since this folly began in 2010, the Republicans attempt to get concessions towards austerity in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. And 2 years ago in 2013, the government was shut down for about 3 weeks over that struggle, and they finally had to back down. They will lose again. We don't know yet whether they will attempt to provoke a confrontation week after next, but they say they're going to. And what are their demands? A balanced budget amendment out of Congress. $3 trillion in cuts, primarily from Medicare and Medicaid. Okay? So Paul Ryan still isn't in yet, and we still don't know exactly what he's going to do, but there's a possible or likely major crisis headed week after next. Then 3 weeks later, there'll be another crisis, December 11th. The government's continuing resolution expires. And again, the government will be subject to a shutdown unless Congress agrees on a plan to continue the government. President Obama vetoed the defense authorization, and he did it saying that we have to stop funny money accounting for the Pentagon. There was a compromise in 2011. The Budget Control Act established what's called sequestration, in which they agreed that both sides agreed that both defense and domestic spending will be limited to a certain percentage. But the Republicans have devised, or actually both parties have devised a way around this called Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCO, in that it's $500 billion to build the war machine, the Pentagon, the military. But that $500 billion only buys you a war machine that you can't use. If you actually want to start a war and send that war machine overseas and fight, they charge extra. And that extra is called OCO, or Overseas Contingency Operations. It reached about $100 billion a year. During the peak of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, it has declined because we don't have as many soldiers overseas as we did a few years ago. But the president's budget still wants $60 billion for OCO. The Republicans want $100 billion because they want to do more in the Middle East than we're already doing. And so the president said, no, you can't do that. I'm going to draw a line. So he vetoed the appropriation, the authorization, and he's threatening again to veto any spending in excess of that. So the second issue that's dividing them is defunding Planned Parenthood, which is a peanut amount of money to the federal government, and it's a completely preposterous issue. I'm sure most people in this room know that, but that's one of the issues the Republicans want to use to threaten to shut down the government. So this is all coming up, and this is one of a cycle of these confrontations that's been happening for the past 5 or 6 years. This people's budget is our alternative. There's a progressive caucus in Congress that does advance progressive principles. And every year they advance the progressive budget, which has now been called the people's budget. And that's our platform. In many respects, peace action would go farther, transit activists would go farther, and so on. But this is still a pretty good platform. And what's so great about it is that it not only cuts defense spending, it not only sends money for transit, and so on. But it brings all the issues of all the progressive struggles together into one platform that we can vote up or down. So it's an alliance platform, it's a coalition platform to unite the people's movements. It addresses jobs. 8 million new jobs will be created. It addresses housing. It addresses education. It addresses health care. It addresses environment. It has a carbon tax. It addresses immigration. It addresses taxes. It would return to a progressive income tax. It would have an extra tax bracket for millionaires, an even higher tax bracket for billionaires. Still only 49%, less than it used to be in the time of Jack Kennedy, but it would be a more progressive income tax than it is now. It would close corporate tax loopholes. It would have a financial transaction tax. It would stop the inversions that allow companies to go overseas and escape taxes. It would deal with the repatriation of income that they earn overseas, and on and on. Again, I will emphasize peace action will go farther than this. This only cuts the defense budget $100 billion a year. And some of that is kind of funny money in a sense that I don't want to go into it, but so we will go farther, but we're still very pleased there's a budget that allows us to unite with all of the other people's issues into a common platform, okay? Now, is the transit portion of the people's budget strong enough? I don't think so, but actually, I don't know. I came to this forum to find out because transit funding is so complicated, as we've learned today. It's hard for the mere mortal activist to figure out what the heck is going on. So we don't think it's good enough. And so one of the things, not just for that reason, but one of the things we're doing this year, Peace Action, is we convened a coalition called the People's Budget Coalition. So we get a lot of national advocacy groups together to push for the people's budget. Because one of the things about the people's budget is it doesn't get a lot of press. It's kind of confusing and it's kind of buried in the Washington. 96 members of Congress voted for it in March. The majority of the Democratic caucus for the first time. In Massachusetts, 3 consistently vote for the people's budget. Capuano, Catherine Clark, and Jim McGovern. Sometimes Lynch votes for it, and sometimes he doesn't. We used to have Tierney, but now he's been replaced by someone who votes against it. So we have 3 that we can count on, and one that Lynch voted for it this year, but he didn't the year before. So we have work to do in getting our own congressional delegation to vote for this thing. Even though there's 96 in the country that voted for it, only 4 in Massachusetts out of 9. So if we think we're a blue state, we can do a little better than that. So we have work to do. We have work to do with Joe Kennedy. We have work to do with Nikki Songas, with Seth Moulton, with Bill Keating, and with Richie Neal, that friend of labor. Okay? So those guys are not voting for the people's budget. Why not? Well, so similarly, nationwide, we're asking that same question nationwide. We're asking in Chicago, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in North Carolina, and so on. And so this People's Budget Coalition, we're on the cusp of launching a new website and a new call for action, and we're going to call for national actions the first week of December, the week before that continuing resolution expires, so that all the groups can get together and put pressure on Congress to support the people's budget, not just when it comes up in March, but all year round, so that it becomes a common theme. So we have an alternative. And we say we have a problem with the T, it's broken down. Okay, let's support it. I'll just add one point to Jonathan's excellent analysis of the nuclear spending. Not only are the submarines built in New London, Connecticut, where do you think the software is built? The guidance system, the high tech that drives that independently targetable warhead to its target. Kendall Square. Okay? It's been built there for years. And actually it was part of MIT and it was spun off. It's the same organization, Draper Labs. Those engineers, those smart software developers and engineers should be building public transit. We've got an MIT guy here who has a futuristic plan. We need those people to make it a reality. but they're all working for the Pentagon. And if those weapons were
Not all.
ever used, it's just unthinkable. It's unthinkable. If any one of those weapons were ever used, it's just unthinkable. So, one more thing. It's not just nuclear weapons where the military is running wild. Let's take the F-35. The most expensive weapons system in history. Okay? It's a new generation of fighter planes. The Pentagon blew it with the was it the F-22? They built a new fancy fighter plane. It was so cool and super duper. It was designed to fight the Soviet Union, but it was so fancy that it couldn't be used, and it was kind of canceled halfway through. So they said, okay, we're going to design yet another fighter plane that is super maneuverable and stealth and everything, but it's also going to be cheap. One design for the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, all the allies, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Israel, everyone will buy these things. Well, guess what? It's the most expensive plane. So they design, and it gets fancier and fancier and fancier. The plane doesn't work. They can't fly it. The test pilots can't fly it because it's too dangerous. They're still working on it. But even though it doesn't work, they're buying 58 planes this year. They're going to fix them later once everything's fixed.
And why not?
That's the plan. So this is the Pentagon at work. This is our tax dollars at work. So again, do we have the money? We have money to burn in this country.
Where are they being built?